Hello and welcome to Nature Live Online. I'm Alison, I'm your host for today's talks. Now, hopefully some of you have been following our Nature Live talks online, but for those of you that are new to Nature Live, we're an event that usually happens at the Natural History Museum in London, where we give our visitors the chance to speak with some of our scientific staff. You can find out more about our collections and the research that goes on behind the scenes here. Now, during lockdown, we can't safely be at the museum, so we've brought Nature Live online. We're going to be bringing our science and our scientists from our homes to yours. In a moment, I'm going to be joined by one of our ecologists, Steph West, and we're going to be finding out about one of her natural history heroes. Now, we are, of course, live, so if you've got any questions at any point during the stream, please do post them in the comments section, and we'll try to answer as many of your questions as we can. But let's meet our speaker today. Steph, are you there?
Hi, Alison. Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, hello, Steph. How are you?
Good, thank you. Yeah, great.
Start by finding out what you do at the museum, first of all.
So I work in the Angela Marmont Centre for UK Biodiversity. That's, for those of you who've been to the museum, that's a little corner at the bottom of the Darwin Centre. And the centre is all about supporting people discovering and researching British wildlife. So we run everything from citizen science projects to an ID service to hosting various groups and societies around the country. My role there is as UK Biodiversity Training Manager. So I'm developing courses. At the moment, I'm developing hopefully a new programme for online UK natural history training, which I'm really excited about and hope I'll be able to bring to everybody later in the year.
Brilliant. We look forward to that. Today, aren't we? A chap called Gilbert White. Now, for those of us that maybe don't know so much about Gilbert, tell us a bit about him. Who was he?
So Gilbert, as you can see in the slides there, he lived, well, his birthday was on the 18th of July, 1720, which is why we're quite so interested in him this year, because obviously this marks his 300th birthday. He was a curate and he spent most of his time living and working around Selborne, which is a little village in Hampshire just to the south of Alton. He spent most of his life there. He grew up in Hampshire. He went to school in Basingstoke and then went to do his degree over at Oriel College in Oxford. He was fundamentally fascinated by the natural world and fascinated by the world and the wildlife around him. And he made extensive notes and discoveries from his home, mostly in Selborne. He was fascinated by the ordinary, and that's what I find quite so endearing about him. He was interested in just ordinary wildlife at home as much as the extraordinary. There's a lovely little passage in a letter that he wrote on the 3rd of July 1778 to a chap called Daines Barrington, who I'll talk a little bit more about later on. And it's just describing the flowering of a crocus, so something that we all know what it looks like. And I'll just read you a really brief passage from his book on that, from that letter. This circumstance is one of the wonders of the creation, little noticed because a common occurrence, yet ought not to be overlooked on account of its being familiar, since it would be as difficult to be explained as the most stupendous phenomenon in nature. It's something that we see every year. We see crocuses flowering, and he was as fascinated by that as some of the latest discoveries in natural history. And it's his focus on the behaviour of wildlife as much as its morphology, its size, its shape, its body form, that made him quite so unique in natural history at the time.
That seems so relevant at the moment. That idea of finding the beauty in the ordinary and the mundane, while we're all on lockdown, looking out the same windows every day. That's quite beautiful. Now, he wasn't a scientist, was he? He's a curate, so he's in Selborne. But what exactly is he doing? He's observing nature.
Yeah, so we can see just where Selborne is on the slides here. So it's a small rural village that he's living in, and that's Selborne today. You know, arguably it's still very much a rural village, and that's his home. Well, it's extended now, but you can see that he's got a garden space that he could spend time in. And what he was doing was he was making notes on on everything, from the plants in his garden that he was growing to what the weather was doing, to the local comings and goings. But particularly, he was noting down the behaviour of wildlife. So when swifts and swallows arrived, and what animals and plants were doing around the local area. You can see here this illustration is from the front of the first edition of his book. It's this beautiful little fold-out engraving, and it shows what we think are Gilbert and some of his family looking back across the village, and I assume observing wildlife while they're there. He noted all of his findings down in journals, his garden calendar that he wrote from 1751, his journals that he started in 1754, and his Naturalist journal, which was a pre-printed book designed for the wildlife recorder, which was given to him by his correspondent Daines Barrington. In 1766, he made a special attempt to try and learn botany, and wrote his Flora Selborniensis, his Flora of Selborne, where he tried to make a daily record of what plants were flowering, particularly around the village, but also noting some of the other things that the wildlife was doing at the same time. Most importantly, though, and this is why we remember him, is that he wrote letters sharing some of his findings with other people, particularly to a gentleman called Thomas Pennant and also Daines Barrington. Now, Thomas wrote British Zoology, one of the first and most complete compendiums of the knowledge of British wildlife at the time. And Daines Barrington was then the vice president of the Royal Society. You can see in this picture here, this is actually the manuscript for his book, which was based on those letters.
Now, the letters are really important. We are going to come back to them in a moment. But in all of his observations, did he find or describe anything new?
Absolutely. There are several new discoveries contained within his letters, some of which he's better known for than others. And a lot of that was because he was recording wildlife in quite a different way to how other people were looking at it. Through his correspondence with friends and with scientists of the day, we can find some of the earliest records of particular species, especially their behaviour. In a series of letters written between 1767 and 1768 to Thomas Pennant, we find the first descriptions of not only the harvest mouse adult, but the juvenile and the nest. He even suggests a name for the species, following Linnaean nomenclature, so the new system of naming that we still use today. Unfortunately, he doesn't get credit for the first description because that letter wasn't published until 1789, and the credit for naming the species goes to Peter Pallas, who was a Prussian zoologist and botanist who published a description of the adult in 1771. And then he's also got what we think is possibly one of the first descriptions of the noctule bat. He describes it as the great large bat in a letter in 1769, but the description of its flight pattern is very characteristic of a noctule, and he compares it to the swift, which is exactly how we would describe a noctule today. But probably the one that I think he's possibly best known for is the very special study that he made on swallows, house martins and swifts. He was particularly fascinated by this species group and all aspects of their flight, their behaviour, and particularly things like whether or not they migrated or hibernated. And the depth of study that he was able to do on these species was essentially what made him of interest to a lot of other people. In 1773, he was invited to write a paper to the Royal Society at the behest of Daines Barrington, and that was read out at the Society on the 10th of February 1774. That was on the behaviour and particularly around nesting of the house martin. You can see the letter here. The Royal Society still own the letters, and they've recently digitised, in fact, I think they published it last week, a high resolution image of that first letter. So you can go and have a read of it yourself. There is a handy transcript if you don't fancy translating the handwriting. And then there was a second letter published later on that year as well, which looked at swallows and swift behaviour as well. So that really was sort of like the first recognition, I think, of his work, or the importance of it.
Now we've got some questions coming in from our viewers. One question asking, did Gilbert travel to other countries, or was he more or less based in Selborne?
No, he never travelled abroad. He did travel within the UK, and I'm going to have a chat with you about some of my research on some of the other places he visited, but he never travelled abroad. He wasn't the best traveller, I think it's safe to say.
Were all of his observations in Selborne?
No, so not everything he did was in Selborne, although obviously that's what he's best known for. Obviously he travelled to Oxford, that's where he went to university, but he spent a lot of time in London, and particularly as I live and work in London, that's particularly fascinating to me. Two of his brothers lived there. You can see what London looked like roughly at the time that White was there. It's much smaller than it is today. But yeah, Benjamin and Thomas lived in London, and it was that really gave him the opportunity to come to the city. And sometimes he'd stay with his brothers for a few weeks at a time, occasionally complaining about the gnats in South London. But if you look carefully at his journals, and particularly his letters, you can find references to where he was and what he was actually observing while he was in London. And that's exactly what's fascinating me at the moment. So I'm trying to sort of look at what he's doing in London, where he is, and see how much we can tie down what he was actually doing while he was here, and how that furthered his work and his opportunities for who he would meet while he was in town. And the principal conversations and his connections came through his brother Benjamin, who owned a publishing house which specialised in natural history. And it was at 63 Fleet Street. You can see an image of what we think is it there. And that publishing house included publishing Thomas Pennant's British Zoology, or one edition of it, as well as many others. So through that, he would have met several different people who have been able to speak to, meet with, and correspond with through letters. You can see what 63 Fleet Street looks like now, a little bit different. But yeah, it's still fascinating to see we still have that link in place. But he mentions numerous other places he visited while he was in London, and notably amidst some as well that you would have thought he would have got to. So he goes to see Sir Lever's Museum in Leicester House, in Leicester Square, but he doesn't go to the Chelsea Physic Garden as far as I can tell, although he did correspond with its director and did have the director's book. So he was very aware of it, and he was definitely staying quite close by. What intrigues me personally is that one of his brothers, Thomas, almost certainly lived very close to where I live in South London, just on the south side of the river. And you can see roughly that area in these two maps from the period. You'll probably be able to see Vauxhall marked most clearly on there to give you a bit of navigation for those of you who know London. I really love the idea that Thomas is being described as putting up scallop shells on the side of his house to provide artificial nesting sites for house martins. And I'd love to think that that house was somewhere close by to where I am now.
Oh, not an easy task to find out, I would imagine.
Yeah, the area was quite rural, so there can't have been too many decent sized houses, but it's I'll get there.
We've got another question from our audience. Did he ever correspond with William Turton, to your knowledge?
Not that I know. I've been through quite a lot of his correspondence. The Selborne Society holds a fantastic archive of Gilbert's letters, which is stored at the Linnean Society in Piccadilly. They've very kindly let me have access to go through all of those papers. I've not seen the reference to him though, no. Might be one hiding around somewhere, I just haven't come across it yet.
So let's talk about those letters, because they are the reason that we're talking about him today, because he was persuaded to publish a book, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. That book is actually a collection of letters based on ones that he wrote to Pennant and Barrington, and they describe much of what he was observing and recording. And you can see in the slide there, that's just a tiny little corner of our Gilbert White shelves in the special collections in the library at the museum. So he was encouraged to write. That book was published in 1789. unsurprisingly at his brother's publishing house. But it's a fascinating read for anyone who hasn't had a look.
It is. I'm reading it at the moment, and I'm absolutely loving it. But it's a brilliant claim to fame, hasn't it? I'm going to read this so I get it right. It's the 4th longest constantly in print book in the English language. Is that right?
Yeah. So since it was first published in 1789, it has never been out of print. So while there are obviously older books and books published at the same time, they've invariably had a period where they've been out of print. So it's only the King John Bible, the complete works of Shakespeare, and A Pilgrim's Progress that have been constantly in print longer. And this one remains the 4th. It's a fascinating quirk of publication history, in all honesty. And a lot of that isn't necessarily to do with the records that are held within it, but more this beautiful and very endearing picture of rural England that caused its survival through times of crisis and wars and things like that. We see a spike in publications, mostly around, mothers sending their sons off with smaller bridge versions or discrete passages from it as a reminder of the green and pleasant land of England, that sort of thing. But it is an old quirk of publication history that the book survived. To date, there have been over 400 editions published in various different formats. It's been translated into 7 languages, and there are numerous biographies and commentaries both on the book and on Gilbert. There's even 2 books written from the perspective of his pet tortoise.
I love that.
Yeah, adorable.
I have the Kindle version, which kind of makes me wonder what Gilbert White would actually make of that. But it paints a really vivid, a wonderful picture, and you get a bit of a sense of Gilbert as a person when you read it as well, don't you?
You really do, yeah. For me, he's always seemed just like such a interesting, observant, thoughtful person. So yeah, I find him as fascinating in many ways as his book, and yeah, it's fascinating to go and see how important he's been to so many other people as well. The museum in his old house at Selborne, the Gilbert White and Oates Family Museum, holds what must be the largest collection of editions of the book, and it's amazing to see the beauty that's put into the construction of some of those books, and the thought that's gone into the preservation of Gilbert White's memories as part of that as well.
You've just answered one of our audience questions, asking whether his house was actually open to the public as a museum.
Yes, it is. So it's in Gilbert's house. There's a museum to both Gilbert, and it's combined with the museum of the Oates family as well. So it's a fascinating place. Do definitely go and see it. Obviously, at the moment, it's closed because of the pandemic, but as soon as it's open, make sure you get yourselves there. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. We've got another question from a viewer asking, did Gilbert ever do any drawings of the animals and plants in addition to his writings?
So there are illustrated versions, and some of those are contemporary with the book. There are some beautiful engravings in the book. I've not seen much in the way of drawings coming from Gilbert himself. Other people may have come across them, but certainly I've not come across any sketches particularly by Gilbert. Perhaps he's a little bit more like me. I'm afraid I can't draw very well.
Me either. Just another question from a viewer asking, what was Gilbert's greatest discovery, do you think?
Ooh,
okay.
That's a difficult one. I mean, I am completely biased, and I studied bats, so I'm going to go with the noctule. But that's just entirely my bias. Obviously, a lot of people would say a lot of things he was finding out about the house martins and swallows and swifts, but for me, it's the noctule because I'm completely biased.
I know. Bats all the way. Now, Steph, what was Gilbert's influence on natural history as a science, do you think?
So for me, and some people might argue this, but for me, he's really the starting point of the amateur naturalist or the biological recorder. He was a non-specialist, self-taught generalist observer of wildlife, incredibly passionate about what he was seeing and watching and wanting to share that with as many people as possible. He was fascinated by ordinary occurrences. He wasn't compelled so much by its use, its purpose, or its classification, just intrinsically interested in the things in their own right. And it's that we really see as the passion and driver behind the amateur naturalist today. His records also contain perfect biological records. They say who he was, what he saw, when he saw it, and where. And that's exactly what we do today as modern biological recorders. And that really has drawn from Gilbert's practice in his observations. So many people will cite him or unknowingly use his methods, whether or not that's a very new person to natural history, someone who just likes to make their own records, all very acclaimed scientists. Most notable of those, you could argue, was Charles Darwin, who referred to White as one of his core influences, and describes himself as having made a pilgrimage to Selborne in 1857. So he's been influential throughout the development of natural history.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, he was born 300 years ago, but we very intentionally called this talk the modern naturalist. What's his legacy today?
His legacy really is modern biological recording, particularly that wealth of biological recorders and citizen scientists we have in the UK, and the data that goes with them. Without amateur naturalists, we would be so far poor in terms of our knowledge of wildlife in the British Isles particularly.
Now, that word amateur it's a bit of a loaded one, isn't it? When we say amateur, we're talking as not professional or unimportant here, are we?
Absolutely not. No, amateur naturalists can mean anyone from person who's taking their first observations and their first biological records. But it could also, a lot of the volunteer amateur naturalists can be some of the foremost experts on particular species or species groups. They contribute an incredible amount to our knowledge of natural history. They might submit thousands of records. They might undertake voluntary services like being verifiers, checking people's records for accuracy, or be county recorders. And those are the people who have a particular specialism in an area and will help people to identify and verify records and confirm them as correct. So they perform an incredibly important function in our understanding and knowledge of British wildlife. Without amateur naturalists, we would know so much less about wildlife and be able to understand change so much. We wouldn't be able to understand change in anything like the same way. What new species are coming into the British Isles, how species are changing, where we're losing species, or where their location around the country is changing, or flowering times and things like that. Just to give you an example, I checked yesterday on the National Biodiversity Network's Atlas, which collates a lot of those records together. And as of yesterday, might have increased by today, the Atlas contains, excuse me, I'm going to have to read this so I get it right, 226,601,454 records across 46,104 species for the UK. It's an incredible depth of data, and that isn't every biological record in the UK by a long shot, but it's that quantity of data, verified data, which allows us to look at real change. We can actually analyze change. That allows us to study things like climate change and what's going on with our species and how we're being affected by anthropological changes to our country and also globally as well.
That is really incredible. So what I, as an amateur, observe could be hugely important. How do I know that my observations or my identifications are accurate, though?
So there are ways of checking yourself. Some apps will allow you, will offer suggestions as to what species you might have photographed. For those of you who participated in City Nature Challenge last weekend, you'll have been using the iNaturalist app, and that uses AI to check your photographs against a database and suggest species, which can help with identification. And of course, there's things like our own identification advisory service, which will help you to make your own identifications, but all records go through a process called verification, and that's where someone else comes along, looks at your records, asks you questions if they're not sure, and they might ask for photographs or possibly even a specimen to help prove that you saw what you saw. So records will be checked. Now, you do need to remember, though, that that process can take some time. Most verifiers are volunteers, and they can become swamped with an awful lot of records, particularly at certain times of year. So you do need a little bit of patience with that.
Okay, that's fair enough. Do you have any top tips for anyone that is keen on amateur natural history?
Yeah, so I've drawn together a couple of suggested ways that you can perhaps be a little bit more like Gilbert White and how to become a natural historian yourself. So this is, for me, you know, kind of Gilbert's legacy, what he was doing and how we can be naturalists ourselves. First off, be curious. So get out there and just start watching wildlife, even if for right now it's just being able to look out of your window and watching birds outside while we're all in lockdown still. But it's those observational skills which are fundamental to the foundation of being a naturalist. And of course, it's so lovely to watch wildlife as well. Secondly, take your notebook out for a walk, or to your window at the moment. But note down what you're seeing. Make sure that you're making that a good biological record. So you're recording who you are, what you saw, when you saw it, and where, so that it can be useful data in the future. And if you can, draw it, stick in a photograph, or if, for example, it's a bird and it flutters off and drops a feather, stick that in there as well. Those sorts of notebooks are fascinating to keep for yourself, but they can also be really, really valuable records to note down what you're seeing. And then learn from others. This is how we build our skills as natural historians. We learn from other people, whether or not that's from joining a social media group, say on Facebook or on Twitter, where people will offer suggestions as to how you can help your identification, or to joining your local wildlife trust or your local natural history society, where you'll meet people or be able to discuss with them identifications, learn from their expertise, and also learn from the mistakes that they made so you don't make the same mistakes too. Share what you find, of course, a really important part of what Gilbert did too, but make sure you contribute to recording schemes or to citizen science projects if you don't fancy doing it without a bit of guidance and structure, or you can just send in your records. Things like the iRecord website and app are great for getting records to most recording schemes really easily. And then the final thing that I think Gilbert really did and isn't perhaps talked much about is encourage wildlife near you as well. Gilbert, perhaps not going to the same extent as Gilbert with what you could term perhaps guerrilla gardening on other people's land. Obviously, you wouldn't suggest that. But perhaps plant a window box or let your lawn grow a little bit longer. Do things in your garden to encourage wildlife. Obviously, we have now man-made nest boxes, so you don't need to nail up scallop shells on the side of your house like Gilbert's brother did. But there's all sorts of ways you can encourage wildlife near you.
Now, Steph, you're currently working from home. As an ecologist, what are you able to do?
Well, I'm really lucky. Even though I can't get to the museum, which is very sad, I do have a little garden outside my London flat, which allows me to watch wildlife and find out what's going on in our little corner of London. Unfortunately, the people that I share that garden with are very keen on wildlife as well, so they don't mind me planting native wildflowers and letting the lawn go a bit long and running around outside with a net looking a little bit strange. But you can see up on that slide there, that's a picture of my desk with my microscope doing a bit of ID as part of City Nature Challenge last weekend. That's where I'm normally found busily working away. My little Gilbert White bookshelf so I can keep going with my research. And a couple of quick snaps there from the trail cam of a jay I had on my feeder and a fox doing a bit of ornithology of his own at the bottom of the garden a couple of weeks ago.
That's brilliant. If you don't have a garden though, is there anything I can do from my tiny little top floor flat in London?
Absolutely, there is. Yeah, there's all sorts of things you can do. If you're not lucky enough to have your own outside space, you could think about planting up a little window box with wildflowers, perhaps, that you can put on your windowsill if you don't have a balcony or any sort of outside space. You can get bird feeders, of course, which attach to the outside of windows, and it's amazing what will come to those, even if you're quite high up. If you have got a little bit of balcony or space outside, then maybe think about even a tiny little pond in a pot and see what manages to make it all the way up to the top floor and your flat. Possibly no newts or other amphibians, but you might get some quite interesting insects coming in there.
I had not thought of that. I'm definitely going to give that a try. I'm currently trying and failing to learn how to identify birds from their song, which I feel Gilbert would approve of.
He certainly would.
Now, we've had a couple more questions in. We had a question earlier, actually, Steph. Someone was asking if we're still finding new species in the UK.
Yes, so there are new discoveries. There are some groups of wildlife which are still very poorly understood. So particularly a lot of nocturnal insects other than moths. We don't know those very well. So Gavin Broad, who's one of our principal curators at the museum, he's quite often finding amazing new small wasps and things like that. And of course, the work that we're doing increasingly on genomics, particularly around metabarcoding, and the Darwin Tree of Life project, which we'll be heavily involved in going forward, will create new avenues for understanding species in the UK. One of the functions that we do in the AMC is we actually manage the master species list, basically, which underpins things like the NBN Atlas. And Chris, who manages that, is quite regularly making changes and alterations and adding new things in. Plus, of course, there's new species which do come into the British Isles as well, either imported or naturally finding their way over the channel.
And we have another question. Someone was asking, how has the wildlife of Selborne changed since Gilbert White's days? Are there any species that are hardly seen now? Any increases in numbers?
So I don't have the records list for Selborne to hand, I'm afraid, so I can't give you exact numbers. There possibly is someone listening in from the Gilbert White Museum who might be able to add to that. But they are actually undertaking a project over there at the moment, which they're calling the Flora of Selborne, to repeat Gilbert White's studies during that year 1766, where he did his Flora Selborniensis. So there will be more data and more records coming in from that area. It is still a very rural village. A lot of the farmed landscape around it is managed quite sensitively for wildlife. So there are some amazing things in there. There have been some fantastic reintroductions and studies of the harvest mice that Gilbert was studying 300 years ago as well. Some of the area around, some of the land around that is designated as SSSI. So a site of special scientific interest, because of the wildlife there is so good. A lot of the land is owned by the National Trust, who manage it very carefully for wildlife. And also there's an amazing site managed by the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust called Nor Hill, which is one of the best known sites for amazing butterflies and fantastic orchids. So it's still a brilliant site for wildlife. We were hoping to do some studies there this year, which unfortunately have been delayed, to find out a little bit more about what the wildlife looks like there now. So there will be some things that have changed. Gilbert even refers to an extinction in one of his letters in the book, which is the extinction of a population of field cricket, a very, very rare insect. And he's sort of lamenting the small boys who've gone in and destroyed the colony. So it's interesting that Gilbert was referring to an extinction event during his writing as well. So I can't give you exact numbers and exact changes, but hopefully that's gone a little way to answering your question.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steph. Does Gilbert get the recognition he deserves, in your opinion?
Well, obviously, I'm going to say no, because everyone does know about Gilbert White. Although I have to admit, an increasing number of my friends and colleagues can no longer say that they haven't heard of him. Apologies to those. Gilbert did go through quite a resurgence in the 1920s around his 200th birthday. And we're very much hoping to generate the same for his 300th this year, hence why I'm doing this talk. But there's various organisations nationally and locally to Selborne, so organisations like the Gilbert White Museum and the Selborne Society, which was set up specifically to preserve the memory of Gilbert White and his work, who have been, keeping that candle burning for Gilbert, as well as museums like our own, the British Library, the V&A and the Royal Society, who all have material from Gilbert White.
Do we have any specimens, any White specimens in our museum at all?
Well, sadly, the only taxidermied specimen that I know of that is likely to have belonged to Gilbert is a hawfinch, which is looked after by the Gilbert White Museum. You can see a little snap I took of it there. Sorry about the terrible photography. So that's the only known likely specimen of Gilbert's. I have checked our bird collections over at Tring Museum. Couldn't find anything despite the amazing help of Alex Ball over there. So unfortunately we haven't got, gosh, I said the wrong Alex Bond. I'm terribly sorry. Wrong Alex. So the only collections that we have in the main museum are a couple of editions of the first edition of the book, and we also have the shell of his pet tortoise Timothy. You can see it there, looking a little bit worse for wear. Sadly, some of the scoots have popped off over the years, but you can see that it's looked after by our senior curator Patrick Campbell, but it is on display. So when the museum's back open, you can come in. If you go down the corridor behind the North Hall Cafe, you'll see it in the reptiles gallery there, so you can go visit Timothy. For in the back of the museum as well, we've got a little display up in the gallery display of the AMC, so a little window display in the Darwin Centre. I'm hoping to keep that up for as long as I'm allowed to. But also we've got something that I'm really quite proud of and quite pleased of as well. Gilbert never actually sat for a portrait in his life. There is a portrait which is named Gilbert White in the National Portrait Gallery, but it wasn't done in life and it's not of him. So what does exist, though, are two pen sketches which were scribbled in the corner of White's copy of Pope's Iliad, which was given to him on graduation, and they were done by a friend of his, and they're just brief pen sketches. You can see one of them at the top of this slide. So that image we know was done in life and is of Gilbert. A volunteer at the Gilbert White Museum made a colorized version of it, which you can see in the bottom left corner. And it's the one we used at the starting slide for this piece as well. And that's a beautiful image, which the Gilbert White Museum let us use to create the portrait on the right. Now, that mosaic portrait is done using an algorithm, which was created by one of our digitization team, Ginger Butcher, and that replaces the coloured pixels in the portrait with specimens of the same colour from our digitized collections. So I asked them to use only pixels from specimens from our UK digitized collections. So a lot of it is butterflies and moths because we've got an awful lot of specimens of those digitized already. And you can see a little close up here where hopefully you can see some of the specimens which have been used to make up that portrait. And that's now hanging in the Angela Marmont Centre. So I'm really pleased. We did that one of Gilbert and also another one of Mary Anning as well.
That's absolutely brilliant. We are sadly running out of time, Steph, but very quickly before we go, if people are particularly interested in finding out more about Gilbert White, where can they go?
So this is the tercentenary year. So here you can see the logo that was created for the tercentenary. The best place to go, I would argue right now, is the website address listed there. So that links you to the tercentenary celebrations where you can find out more about Gilbert, and you can also find out more about the events and what we are going to be able to do to celebrate his birthday. So obviously some of those events have had to change and be delayed a little bit, but hopefully there's still plenty going on you can find out about. You can look on the Gilbert White Museum website. They've got some fantastic blogs and articles on there, or follow the hashtag GW300 on Twitter, where you'll get up-to-date information about things that are going on. I'm just about to write an article for the NHM website, which hopefully will be going live in June. So you'll be able to see that shortly. And for our museum members, watch your doorstep for your next issue of Evolve magazine, because there's a couple of articles in there looking at Gilbert White's life in a bit more depth, and also looking a bit more about how you can start to be a natural historian in your own back garden too.
That's brilliant, Steph. We look forward to that. I'm just going to squeeze in one last question from a viewer asking, what kind of equipment did Gilbert have available in the field?
Interesting. So a lot of what he would have been collecting would have been given to him by local farmers. And you could argue that given the time period, probably the piece of equipment that was used most was the shotgun. He may have tried to use nets. He refers to material having been collected for him a lot. He wouldn't have had access to binoculars, that sort of equipment. Yeah, he wasn't a wealthy man at all. He would not have had access to, things, optics like binoculars or microscopes. He was very much doing this from observations using his own two eyes.
Well, that's very encouraging, because a lot of us at home don't have that kind of equipment either, but we can still be a bit more Gilbert.
Indeed. Hopefully everyone will be.
Well, Steph, I'm afraid we are completely out of time. It's been brilliant speaking to you today. Thank you so much for introducing us to Gilbert. I am definitely a convert. I'm going to try and be a bit more Gilbert in my everyday life. Thank you to our viewers for all your brilliant questions. We're taking a bit of a break this Friday, but we will be back next week with more of our science. I believe we're going to be talking to one of our scientists about Mars, so do join us again next week. Now we'll say goodbye. Take care out there, and we hope to see you soon.